Hello, friends. Welcome to another session of Tata Katha, where we have the renowned author, Dr. Shashank Shah, who's written the path-breaking book on the Tata Group. Hello, Shashank. How are you?
Hi Girish, I'm good. It's great to be back on the third episode of Tata Katha, and it's been an interactive journey. You've been asking some very insightful questions and given me an opportunity to look back at the lot of interactions I'd had with several Tata leaders, the site visits, and a lot of research I had done to put my book together. So just fact file there. I have about 1,500 endnotes in my book, which when I look back, I feel, wow, that was the kind of reading I had done to get the entire story of the group across 15 decades together. So, yeah, so let me ask you a question. Today, let's reverse the roles and let me ask you the first question. And
Sure.
that question is simple. It's about what did you like about my book and how did you come across my book? Because you've had some very nice words to say about the book and you've also been interviewing me for this Tata Katha. So let me know from you, what is it that you liked about my book? And something
All right.
like about my book. So I'm not asking you to praise the book, but give your honest opinion because
No, sure.
listeners, Girish is from the first batch of business graduates from the very reputed Management Development Institute or MDI Gurgaon. And he is a veteran, an expert in the field of agribusiness. So he has a lot of experience behind him and some great institutional affiliation. So yes, Girish, please tell me.
Yeah, well, I must tell you how I happened to get hold of your book, first of all, Shashank. I had gone to this bookshop called Bahari Sons in Gurgaon. And without expecting to see your book, because I didn't know that this book was coming out. And I think this was somewhere in early 2019. And so I have been, as you are aware that, I have been a very dedicated student, if I may call myself that, of the Tata Group. I have read a lot of books on the group, largely by R.M. Lala and subsequently a book by Harish Bhatt. And so when I went there, I saw your book, and in fact, I have a copy right here. And when I saw the book, the first thing that I did was picked it up, went through the table of contents. I liked what I saw, and then I stood there and flipped through the book, and I read a few passages from the book, and I was quite hooked, if that is the right word to use. And then I took the book and sat down in a corner because that bookshop has a cafe also attached to it. So I took the book and sat at the cafe, and I went through the notes section at the back, which you have, and then I looked at the quality of your research, and then I again flipped through the book. So I must first of all tell you a few things. First of all, I think this is the most comprehensive book that has ever been written on the Tatas. The earlier books that I had read, they used to cover part of the story. So somebody would write about Mr. Jamsetji Tata, Dorab Tata, and the starting of the Tata Group. Then there would perhaps be a book which was totally dedicated to J.R.D. Tata, and then other books of R.M. Lala primarily. So if you look at the wealth creation, there he's written tidbits about multiple groups, multiple companies in the group. Beyond the Last Blue Mountain is essentially J.R.D. Tata's journey. And in that book as well, if you look at it, I think perhaps 60% of the book is dedicated to his tenure with Air India. And subsequently, Harish Bhatt's book of Tata Log was essentially he had spoken about some modern day businesses. So this was the first book which I thought was comprehensive in the truest sense because one, you covered all the entire 15 decades. One. Second, you dug deep at the right places and to the right extent. And third, you covered the pioneering spirit of the group in terms of how they got into multiple new businesses. Second, you also covered their emphasis on ethics, values, culture, and people. Third, you also covered globalization in terms of how the company went ahead and acquired Tetley, how they went ahead for Chorus, how they went ahead with Jaguar Land Rover. And therein you covered the rationale for the business. You covered the financials. You also covered how was the finances arranged. And I think one thing which you have covered, which none of the other books have covered, is the financial performance of the group. and you have looked at the group in its totality. So I still remember, if you look at your page 68 of your book, wherein you have covered, I think, 31 companies which have delivered. So if you look at shareholder returns, I think from you have covered a particular period wherein the Tata Group has delivered more returns than the Reliance Group also. And then you have listed those companies which have kind of beaten the stock market in terms of returns over a longer period. I think that analysis is priceless. So if you read the book, it gives you a very deep insight into the, if philosophy is the right word to use, I don't know whether philosophy is actually the right word to use or not, but the rationale, the philosophy, the go-to-market strategy, the way that Tata have gone about nurturing their businesses, I think that adds immense value to any manager, any reader, and also I would say to leaders of businesses. And I would strongly recommend this book for two, three sets of people. One, definitely within the Tata Group. I'm not very sure whether this has been made mandatory reading for all the new joinees of the group or not. It is definitely a mandatory reading for all the new joinees of the Tata Administrative Service. This should definitely have its pride of place at TMTC. In fact, most graduates or most people who come for courses at TMTC, this can be a gift from TMTC to them. This is also an ideal gift that can be given to multiple foreign collaborators that the group has. That is one. Second, I would also say that people who own businesses, especially at a medium and large scale level, and also CEOs who lead these businesses, because certain things come, there are a lot of very substantial takeaways from the book. First one being in terms of having a long-term vision for your company and not compromising your own personal set of values and ethics for short-term gains. That is one. The second is also to have a global perspective. The third is to see if you can create multiple revenue streams and multiple businesses also perhaps, so that the business cycles across businesses and across geographies can be managed so that the group overall does not suffer. The third, I would say, is on having the right orientation and mindset which you instill and inculcate in your people, and the championship of ethics and values, and driving the right culture pillared on these two, three things in your group. Because I strongly believe that you might compromise, in the short term, but in the long term, that compromise itself becomes a way of life for the organization. And leaders especially then tend to think of everything as being, manageable, which I don't think stands anyone in good stead in the long term. If your character is lost, then like they say, everything else is lost. So, and I must also compliment you, Shashank, if I may, on the very beautiful handwriting that you have. And it's quite, I don't know if authors usually end up having such a beautiful handwriting. I have also attempted to write a few books, and my handwriting is nowhere as close to this. So compliments on that as well. And yes, and the last thing that I would like to, kind of suggest what business leaders can take away from the group as well as from your book is on the societal contribution of the Tatas and the way they have gone about it. They have, first of all, kept it structured. You have the Tata Trusts. They have kept it vast. They look at livelihoods, they look at education, they look at healthcare, they look at any other thing that is affecting the nation. In fact, if you recall, the first response of the Tata Group after the pandemic struck was to commit 1,500 crores to address the crisis in the country, as well as to collaborate with multiple organizations to address the shortfall that the country is experiencing in terms of masks, kits, hospitals, as well as to create a subsidiary that has that testing mechanism in place that creates those tests for COVID-19. And above all, I think your book is actually an institution on an institution, and it's a tremendous effort, Shashank. Heartiest congratulations to you on this. As someone who has read so many books and magazines and articles on the Tatas, I think this book will stand truly stand the test of time, probably the next 150 years as well. Kudos to you for this.
Thank you, Girish. That's so nice of you to have given a comprehensive account of what you liked in the book, why you liked it, and for whom it is relevant. A small follow-on question I'd like to ask, because while there are a lot of admirers of the Tata Group, there are a lot of people who feel that there is a lot of exaggeration associated with many things that have been done by them. And that's, of course, a lens that people can have. They're free to have. Everybody in the world is free to have their own views. But in your reading, and because you've read so many books, did you find the book being biased or hagiographic, or trying to be superlative about the group or its leadership, or not? I mean, that's another thing, and as an author, I'd like to get your thoughts on.
No, I did not. In fact, I found the book to be quite balanced. You have written about the controversies that the group has gotten into. You have written about the way they have gone about in terms of managing it, and the effect that those controversies have had on the public standing of the Tatas. You have also written about some of the business decisions which they have taken, which did not go right for them. And I think on that you have been quite fair. And also, if you look at it on balance, if a group does 10 things and if 2 of them don't work out well, but 7 or 8 of them work out to be quite well, then I think that the group has passed the test, so to speak. It has done quite well. And your book, I think, covers the 7 things or 8 things that have gone right. It also covers the 2 or 3 things that have not gone right. So I think it's a very balanced book that you have written, Shashank.
Great. I'm glad you feel that, because as an author, I've also always believed that the job of a book is to do justice to the story and not to try and find faults with the protagonist, because most of the writing of late has become very critical of the protagonist, and we feel that the protagonist or the institutions or their leadership should be infallible just because they are on a high pedestal. That's not the case. After all, it is human beings on both sides of the table, and both have their limitations. So thanks for your thoughts, and I hope all the readers, the book has received very good feedback as a bestseller, but I do feel that the book continues to be relevant over the next several decades, because I've covered almost 15 decades of their journey, more than 15 decades of their journey. And this is an institution which thinks from century to century. So I'm sure in the 22nd century, when the Tatas do continue, maybe with a different set of businesses, as relevant to those times, the values and the purpose which they practiced over the last 150 years would continue to be inspiring, and this book would play some small role in telling that story. So thanks, Girish. Thanks for your thoughts. And over to you. You can now don the role of asking me the questions.
If I may just add one more point, I think this book is also should also be made compulsory reading, and is definitely compulsory reading for all students of business schools, because that is the time that you are learning all your courses. And if you have the story of institution that covers 150 years, it, I think, somewhere hones your decision making skills. It also hones what one would call as one's purpose in life and an organization's purpose. And I think this book brings it out extremely well. So Shashank, the Tatas, when they started off with businesses that were new to the country. They started off with a very large cotton processing unit. Then they moved on to a very large hotel. Then they moved on to a very large steel plant. And then they moved on to a very large hydropower business. So this pioneering spirit that has been the hallmark of the Tata Group, it is evident in most of the businesses and industries that it has entered. What do you think are the lessons that one can draw from these decisions of the Tata Group, especially in terms of identifying a need and catching and addressing that need much ahead of its time?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question. Pioneering is one word which describes the Tata Group and its companies and its leaders historically. In fact, since you mentioned about a lot of books that you've read on the Tata Group, I must mention here about Mr. R.M. Lala, or Rusi Lala, an eminent journalist who was a biographer of the Tata Group. He was also connected with several Tata companies and also was on the board of Tata Trusts. And his books have documented several historical facts and stories connected with the Tatas of that era. A book on Jamsetji and his life, a book on JRD and his life, a book on Tata Steel, a creation of wealth, book on Tata Sons. So he had a very good and comprehensive understanding of the Tatas in the years subsequent to India's independence. And to tap his understanding of the Tata Group, he was once asked by a young Tata manager about what are the one or two things that he feels makes the Tata different from any of the corporations of his time. This was sometime in the late 1980s. And after thinking for a while, he said, of course, one of the things which is unique about the Tatas is they look for others' benefits in every decision they make. Second, he said, is about the human touch. There is a very clear human touch in all the decisions that the Tatas have made. And that's why human here is about people, and people can be in any of the form of the stakeholders. So we see the multi-stakeholder approach as being Tata's approach all through the decades. And then he paused for a while, and then he said that he'll add one more word, and that is pioneering. Whatever businesses the Tatas do, they try to be a pioneer in it. So as you mentioned, since its inception, they have been pioneers in several industries. They've also been pioneers in setting products and processes which have been the first of their kind in those sectors or in those geographies. They've pioneered the transformation of established business models. They've pioneered the redefining of prevailing industry structures. And they've pioneered in trying to make systemic changes so that the apathetic approaches of existing players no longer affect the system, and there is a very fresh look at doing and dealing with things. So you mentioned several companies that they started with from Jamsetji's time, and the same continued with every successive chairman at the Tata Group, whether it's Dorabji or JRD or Mr. Ratan Tata. So I don't want to elaborate on the pioneering work they've done with specific companies, and I'm sure the viewers can look up my book, because I've covered almost every pioneering endeavor of the Tata Group in substantial detail. But what I'll capture here are three different facets with respect to pioneering: how they pioneered a product, how they pioneered an entire industry category, and how they pioneered a decision with respect to regional development in India. Something very different from what we usually associate with the word pioneering. So let me give the first example, and that is of Tata Salt. It's something so commonplace. The jingle is very popular. Namak ho Tata ka, Tata Namak. That's been around for almost 3.5 decades now. But there's a very interesting story as to how they got into the business of making salt. This was in the early 1980s. The government of India had collaborated with UNICEF to actively promote the use of iodized salt in order to deal with the iron deficiency that was increasingly evident in children. In fact, in 1984, goitre, a disease which is caused primarily due to iodine deficiency, had reached endemic proportions. And the then Prime Minister of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, had approached Tata Chemicals to help the government address this rising concern. And true to the Tata spirit and the way of and their way of taking up any such opportunity to so serve the communities in need, here it was the nation in need. And so they launched a pan-India movement of salt iodization. And they launched what was the first ever iodized salt in India, which was the Tata Salt. So it was actually in a missionary mode that the whole idea and the product as Tata Salt came into existence. And over the years, Tata's leveraged the importance of this product by creating a strong emotional connect with customers. In the last several years, Tata Salt has ranked among the most trusted food brands. And a fact file is that it is the most consumed Tata product across all industry categories, with every alternate Indian consuming Tata Salt, which is about 65 crore or 650 million consumers. I think that would be one of the most consumed product on the planet. by a particular company. It's almost twice the size of America. Imagine one company providing twice the size of the population of America, a particular product is a great achievement. I remember my interaction with Mr. Gopalakrishnan, who was then director of Tata Sons, who was formerly the vice chairman of Hindustan Unilever and had a phenomenal corporate career. He shared with me that taking a common commodity like salt and packaging it and making it India's largest and one of the most popular food brands and developing an entire ecology and ecosystem of business around it is a huge innovation, a huge pioneering endeavor, which we don't tend to focus on because we take it for granted. How many business schools talk about the journey of Tata Salt and how it is a phenomenal learning experience, taking a common commodity, making it iodized, launching it as a nationwide movement, creating a very strong brand and a jingle around it, creating an entire distribution ecosystem, and eventually making it among the most consumed products from the Tata group is a great success story. And there are many such which we tend to ignore. And you being from agribusiness would be able to appreciate the importance of what I'm saying because it's a very difficult task that they have indulged in and they have been successful with. So that's one example on pioneering ventures by the Tata Group. The other example I would like to give is something they did, which was not for the first time with respect to the product per se, but how they beat a market leader through a pioneering technology. Here I'm talking about Titan and its entry into the watch market. Very few of the listeners would know that Titan is actually a collaboration between Tata's and Tamil Nadu Industrial Development Corporation. And that's why the name is Titan. TI is the Tata Industries and TAN is connected with the Tamil Nadu Industrial Development Corporation. And it was started in early 1980s in Hosur, which was then not a much developed area, but Hosur owes it a lot to Tata's developmental, industrial development endeavors in that space, creating the ecosystem for that. But I'm not talking about it here. I've elaborated about that in my book, but how Titan played a phenomenal role in not only empowering or contributing to the socio-economic development of Hosur, but of almost 200 villages in the vicinity of the Krishnagiri and Dharmapuri districts of Tamil Nadu, which are in the vicinity of Hosur. So that's a phenomenal socio-economic impact. But I'm talking about something very different here. In 1980s, when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi became the Prime Minister of India, his government began to ease rules for the private sector. And it allowed private industries to tweak their product mix within the quantity approved under the license Raj. And this was a policy change which was of immense help to Titan. It was just a fledgling organization. And they made the most of it because they had made quite a lot of investments for an integrated manufacturing facility at Hosur. And they stormed the Indian market with their analog electronic quartz-based technology in 1987. This was a time when the Indian watch market was dominated by mechanical watches. And HMT, with its tagline, Desh Ki Dhadkan, was the market leader. They had a phenomenal market share, 90% market share. Today, HMT doesn't exist, but for the benefit of the viewers, I'd like to say that HMT was a very popular brand. Every aspiring graduate would look forward to a gift of HMT watch when they complete their degree. And every loving father and mother would present that as a gift. And it was started in the early 1960s by then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru as a public sector unit. But here came Titan, a private sector brand, and they did something very different. When the market was dominated by HMT's mechanical watches, the Titan's trendy designs played a very important role in turning the tables. Until then, watches in India were considered as a functional product, as a utility product to see the time. But Titan revolutionized the way in which Indians thought about watches and the way Indians perceived the use of a watch. They converted the watch from a utilitarian timekeeping device to a fashion accessory. I mean, that's a phenomenal marketing strategy in order to make a watch mainstream to a very large user base. And eventually it went on to become the 5th largest watch manufacturer in the world and ranked amongst the largest retail companies in India with nearly 60% market share of watches. And of course, it broke Tata's jinx with consumer-facing businesses and built a super successful customer-centric retail business. So this is another example of pioneering. So you need not pioneer a particular product. You can pioneer an entire ecosystem connected with the product in an area where a competing product has already got 90% market share. I cannot remember of another example of this kind. Tatas themselves have not been successful in the automobile business in order to beat Maruti, which has a similar market share like HMT had. It was also a kind of a PSU like HMT, but they achieved phenomenal success in Titan, and that's why the example I'd like to give. With respect to the automobile business, they've been very successful on the innovation side, and I've covered that in my book. The way they launched Indica, or the way they brought in Tata Ace, and the innovations associated with Tata Nano. So there are other kinds of pioneering ventures there. But here I'm talking about taking on the market leader and turning the tables and being a pioneer with a new technology and a very fresh look at the way that product is perceived by the largest market base, which is working professionals with respect to watches. And the last example I'd like to give is of pioneering with respect to regional development. Of course, we know the story of how they pioneered the regional development of Jamshedpur, the erstwhile Sakchi, when some of the earliest reports of the British government said that this area is not at all conducive for establishment of any corporate venture. They not only proved them wrong. Today, Jamshedpur over the last 9 decades has emerged as quite a role model of how industrial development can contribute to a development of a self-sufficient city. But they replicated that at Michapur. They've replicated that at Babrala. They've replicated that to an extent in the Tata Motors plant in Chinchwad and Pimpri near Pune. So that has been done. But I'm giving another example here of pioneering in terms of regional development. And that's with respect to their investment in West Bengal. The Tatas were considering a fixed investment of about 1,500 crores for their manufacturing plant for Nano. And the intention was that this would create about 10,000 new jobs. And if that's the promise, both in terms of investment and job creation, several states were wooing the Tatas with incentives and subsidies. So they had several examples, several options to choose from. Pantnagar in Uttarakhand, they had Singur and Kharagpur in West Bengal, and of course Sanand in Gujarat. Very few people would know that these options were open to Tatas even before they opted for Singur in West Bengal. And why they opted for Singur is why I call them in pioneering in their approach with respect to regional development. In Pantnagar, for example, Tata Motors had already established a 1,000 crore plant for manufacturing Tata Ace. With respect to Kharagpur, they already had their plants of Tata Metallics and Tata Bearings there. So they had to choose between Sanand and Singur, both of which there were no plants or no factories by the Tata Group. Both had their advantages. With respect to Sanand, it was close to Ahmedabad, which was Gujarat's commercial capital. And you had an enterprising chief minister and Mr. Narendra Modi then. I'm talking about 2007. And Singur had its advantages. It was close to the national highway and to West Bengal's capital, that is Kolkata. And it was being ruled by the communist governments led by Mr. Jyoti Basu since 1977. But Mr. Buddhadev Bhattacharya, who was then chief minister, wanted to bring in industrialization for the state, an area in which it was lagging during most of the left rule there. In a substantial measure. So they too were trying to woo Tata Motors for their investment. Uttarakhand, in fact, offered a very attractive package with a 10-year tax holiday. And that would have meant savings of about 16,000 rupees per unit for Tata Motors. However, the Tatas decided to establish the Nano plant in Singur. And it's very important to note why they did that. And this is the insight I've received directly from his office in my interactions with many of the senior leaders in Tata Sons at that point in time. Mr. Tata personally believed that the eastern side of India hadn't seen much of development for several decades. In fact, West Bengal's contribution to net manufacturing output had reduced from 25% to mere 4% between the 1960s and the early 2000s. And it was reeling under a debt of about 2 lakh crores. So he believed that setting up a nano plant in West Bengal, in Singur, would be a catalyst in India's industrial journey. So this is quite a pioneering way of looking at selection of a manufacturing plant. You don't just look at what will give you value, what will give benefits to the consumers, but also what will give benefits to the nation in a very different way. And they did not look at the nation in terms of states. They looked at all states belonging to the nation. And hence the development of West Bengal was as important for the growth of India as the development of Gujarat, or for that matter, development of Uttarakhand or Maharashtra. And that's a very pioneering outlook in the way locations are selected for setting up plants and making industrial investments. So these are 3 examples I thought which would be very insightful for the listeners. But the list of pioneering ventures by the Tatas is quite endless. Whether it is TCS, which created a new sector, a new industry, their on-site offshore model, and the kind of global presence that it established by its pioneering presence in several countries, helped the subsequent IT companies in a substantial measure. Very few people know that TCS was in existence more than a dozen years before Infosys and Wipro came into existence. And the benefits that Infosys and Wipro had in the international markets was because of the experience that many of the international customers had with the pioneering work TCS did with its on-site offshore model. Tata's Steel and its work with retail value management, they pioneered that, and they transformed the steel into a B2C commodity, like a soap, and used the soap-like distribution network of several established FMCG companies to ensure that steel has a phenomenal retail presence. Or for example, making of Tata Swachh, where 6 Tata companies got together to provide the cheapest drinking water solution in the world. So there is quite an endless list of pioneering ventures that Tatas have contributed to. And I'm sure they do truly deserve the word pioneering in all that they have done.
Thank you so much, Shashank. I continue remaining amazed by the wide variety of examples that you are able to quote. I was also thinking that, since Tatas are such a large empire, one of the advantages of operating across multiple industries is the ability of the group to weather adverse business cycles in one company or in one industry with another company or another industry. Also, the business cycle in one geography with the business cycle in another geography. And one of the reasons why I kind of started thinking more deeply on this was due to the pandemic. While as multiple industries got impacted, specifically hotels and airlines, but other industries continued being relevant. And then a lot of companies which have prominently been only in the hotel industry, let us say the Oberoi Group or OYO, for example, or companies that have only been in airlines, Air India, for example, or Indigo, they got severely impacted. But a company like Tata's, or a group like Tata's, which has presence across multiple industries, is able to offset lack of performance or perhaps negative performance in these companies and industries by some stellar performances in some other industries. And therefore, also, if you look at the group's composition, what TCS is today to the Tatas was a mantle which was held by Telco a few years back, and something which was held by Tisco many years back. So therefore, how, in your opinion, has a diversified presence helped the Tatas?
Yeah, so in my conversation with Mr. Ratan Tata, I had mentioned to him that during his time, the group transformed itself from India's largest conglomerate to India's most globalized conglomerate, with its sales increasing from 25,000 crores to 6.5 lakh crores. That was a 25x increase in 25 years. That's a phenomenal growth by any parameter. And I asked him what was his thought about the globalization endeavors that the group had made. And he shared that his desire for globalization was not driven by the aspiration for growth. He recalled the economic downturn in the year 2000 when Tata Motors was the hardest hit. This was just prior to the year 2000. And that was the time they had posted a loss of 500 crores, which was the largest ever loss posted by any a publicly listed company until then. And there was a downturn in the truck industry, and freight had collapsed because the level of economic activity had dropped. So he thought that his companies were in some way prisoners in one economy. And if you are in the down cycle in that economy because the industry is down for cyclical reasons, then you are dead. And that was a personal experience at Tata Motors. So that was a spark which inspired him to venture into other economic zones so that the downturns in one and the upturns in the other would balance each other out. Unfortunately, there were never two upturns together. In fact, what we've seen in recent times is two downturns together. But what he said was that the numbers that they benefited from the global economy were so large that it wasn't quite the balance that they were looking for because their size increased phenomenally due to their global presence. And then he said that the public opinion was that the group ventured to go global so that they could become the biggest. And he said something very sweet. He said, with putting my hand on my heart, I can say that that was not the reason for going global. They chose to grow global and inorganically only in areas where they felt that they had a technology gap or a strategic gap in geographic coverage. And he gave the example of Tata Steel. Despite the fact that Corus hasn't done well and to their expectations. He said that they were not getting approvals for 8 to 9 years on the steel plant they had wanted to build in Odisha, which is the Kalinganagar plant, which has now come up in such a phenomenal way. And the acquisition of Corus gave them that volume overnight in about, they could add about 19 to 20 million tons manufacturing capacity overnight. And I remember in one of the interviews, Mr. Muthuraman had shared that that was made available to them at half the price than what they would have had to invest if they would have gone for a greenfield venture, for which two approvals were not coming for nearly a decade. So there were always strategic issues that led them to take these decisions, whether it is geographic diversification, industry diversification, or technological diversification. You gave the example of them balancing out different industries so that they can leverage on the changing or emerging opportunities in the environment. But I think historically, their presence in multiple industries has not been so much of an outcome of a desire to grow big, but more so from a desire to contribute to India's growth through industries that had long gestation periods and where companies were not willing to invest patient capital. I've covered in my book examples of British companies who were quite the market leaders in those areas, but not willing to invest in British India in industries or areas where a long gestation periods were involved. They wanted far quicker turnaround. But Jamsetji's approach was very different. His choice of industries, whether steel and power, were not so much an outcome of the financial benefits that would accrue to him through them, but because he wanted to contribute to India's strength and self-sufficiency, which he believed personally, and he had mentioned that on several platforms, was a prerequisite for India's political independence. And so during most of his travels, he compared India with the industrialized nations of the world and felt that there were three areas where India could do well. And for that, steel, which was very important for its industrialized journey, science and technical education, which would be very important for getting the right kind of manpower ready for an independent India. And of course, cheap electric power, which was must for it's his favorite city, which is Mumbai. And along with cheap, I would say also clean, because it was hydropower. And we're talking about his vision nearly 12 to 15 decades back. So he was convinced that these three would contribute to national growth. And he dedicated 25 years of his life to these three. And all these three ventures, as we discussed in one of the previous episodes, came into existence after his demise. Tata Steel, Tata Power, and of course the Indian Institute of Science, for which Jamsetji bequeathed half his estate and that's a phenomenal example of philanthropy in those years. That also at a time when he was not certain whether his vision for such an institution would come true, because the Indian Institute of Science, or the IISc, came into existence nearly a decade after Jamsetji passed away. So that's the kind of priorities they had while they selected industries where they wanted to be present. For example, the establishment of Taj Hotels. That was the only company currently in existence which was established in Jamsetji's lifetime. In 1903, he presided over his inauguration. And he had shared that time with the Times of India that he was building the Taj Mahal Hotel to attract people to India. He had no desire to own the place. He had intense pride and affection for Bombay and wanted to give something back to this cherished city and for the benefit of its citizens. And his passion for this is evident from the fact that the 20 lakh rupees in those years spent for setting up the Taj Hotels was not from Tata and Sons, but from his personal contribution. So that's the kind of passion that the leaders have had in investing in industries and establishing companies which are relevant to the day and age. We already looked at the kind of contribution Dorabji made and why he selected the companies and industries that he did during his 29 years as group chairman. Under JRD too, most of the companies were established with similar nationalistic intentions, albeit for strengthening a newly independent India. While Jamsetji was looking at making India strong for becoming independent, JRD was working towards strengthening an already independent India. And I've in fact captured in my book excerpts from his letter that he wrote on the day India became independent, and the vision he had for the Tata Group and its companies to contribute to making India a strong and industrialized nation in the Committee of Nations. And this was not something he wanted to do because India had become independent. He ventured to do this a decade before India became independent. For example, the establishment of Tata Chemicals was at a time when India produced no industrial chemicals and depended on imports for basic soda compound inputs that were used in textiles or in glass or in paper or the soap industries. Hence, the proposed venture would be very relevant to Indian industry. And you must read, the viewers must read the whole story of Tata Chemicals, how they struggled for an entire decade without making profit due to World War II. But JRD refused to give up because he was convinced that alkali and chemicals were the germ cells of industry and believed that through this company, he'd be helping India with the means to become a modern industrial state. So you see, again, the decisions for getting into certain companies, investing in certain companies was not directly connected in any way with just the financial benefits that they would get, but a much longer term vision. I'd like to give the example of the same Tata Chemicals proposal for setting up a fertilizer complex. And they wanted to contribute to India's green revolution and contribute to the food self-sufficiency through indigenous manufacture of fertilizers and thereby reduce the import burden. But the viewers should look up the book and they know that it took 27 years between 67 when the plant was first proposed to the government under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and 1994 when under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, the Tata Shuddh, the fertilizer factory, was inaugurated at Babrala in UP. And between these two, between the intervening 27 years, India not only saw 7 different prime ministers, but the country spent approximately 45,000 crores to import fertilizers, when a company within their own geography could have done that if permissions were given in 1967 itself. So that's the kind of challenges they faced in trying to venture into newer areas. This is something which the current startup guys, the entrepreneurs, the young managers wouldn't be able to relate to. But there are many such stories which tell us as to why India took a long time to grow at the rate at which it grew. And we lost precious 4 decades to several expensive experiments, which kind of made us a laggard in the group of nations which became independent around the same time. We took a much longer time to become economically successful. Similar stories of alignment with national interests can be seen in the establishment of Telco or Tata Motors or Lakme, the cosmetics brand, which was eventually sold to HUL, or TCS, and several other companies which were started during JRD's time. At Air India, for example, the phenomenal contribution of JRD with respect to civil aviation was a personal passion. He not only pioneered Air India because he knew the science and technology associated with civil aviation, but he also pioneered Air India and worked for it after its nationalization because he wanted to prove a point that public sector units could do very well and give phenomenal customer service if there was the right kind of leadership associated with it. And the viewers would be surprised to know that Cathay Pacific and Singapore Airlines sent their staff to learn service quality and customer service from Air India in the 1960s when they were establishing their presence in the eastern countries, Far Eastern countries. So that's the kind of priority displayed with respect to establishment of companies in the JRD years. And finally, coming to the Ratan Tata years, I think him starting certain companies was to plug the gaps that existed in the Tata portfolio, especially with respect to high-tech industries. In his decade in the 1980s, when he became the vice chairman of the group, he primarily set up next-gen companies like Tata Telecommunications or Tata Honeywell or Tata Elxsi or Tata IBM. So the multi-industry presence has definitely helped the group, not only financially, but across industry cycles, across geographies, across sectors, and also leveraging the complementarity of B2B and B2C businesses. But I'd like to highlight one thing here, which the viewers also should reflect on. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had famously said during the Shah Bano case that after all, I'm a politician. So the decisions taken should balance political and administrative interests. Similarly, the Tatas are a business house and financial parameters are as important as any others. And they have prioritized them equally over a century. And as Girish mentioned, I've captured that in my book as to how 16 Tata companies between 92 and 2018, if we divide a notional amount of a lakh invested equally among them, they've given 4 times the returns than the BSE Sensex, and they've given far more returns than the most eminent international groups such as GE or Mitsubishi or Siemens, or for that matter, even better than Reliance or the Birla companies, and also better than Berkshire Hathaway during those years. So they have also done financially well for themselves and their shareholders, but that was not the only parameter they used in order to venturing into the industries they did.
Dr. Shah, I also wanted to understand that how do you look at the strategies and priorities as far as diversification is concerned of other business houses in India?
While Tata's diversification was based on several factors I discussed, they have inspired several conglomerates like Larsen & Toubro or Reliance in diversifying into unconnected areas. For example, in Larsen & Toubro, we saw the low margins and long gestation projects inspire Mr. Nayak to venture into high margin areas like IT, like finance, like realty, like consulting. I read in the book on Larsen & Toubro by Mr. Gopalakrishnan, where he quotes Mr. Nayak as saying that one of the reasons why L&T diversified into these other areas were because of the low margins and the long gestations involved in the infrastructure and construction projects that L&T was involved in. Reliance, for example, its transition from an oil major to a retail and communications major was influenced by factors like the declining role that oil will play in the emerging green economies of the world, and the role that telecom and retail will play in a country like India, where there'll be 100 crore people in the middle class by 2035. So diversification has been a strategy that most conglomerates have ventured into for various reasons. With respect to Tata's, I can say historically, while financials was definitely one reason, there were several other parameters, and a lot of them had to do with the development of the nation and its people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shashank. I also feel that the Tatas, apart from being pioneering in their ventures, have also tried to stay relevant to the times. So if you look at some of their initiatives currently, be it the tie-up with Starbucks, be it Tata Click, be it Air Vistara, be it Tata Digital, be it also the formal sari outlets that they are coming out with under the Tanishq brand. I think this speaks volumes of a 150-year-old company still being a little nimble, still trying to spot opportunities and still trying, not trying, actually being in tune with the times that they are in. And thank you so much, Shashank, for this, as usual, a very enlightening session, very wide variety of examples. And thank you so much, viewers, for being a part of this episode of Tata Katha. We look forward to having you again in our next episode. Thank you.